Nobody is born hating an entire people. Hatred like that is not natural. It is not instinct. It is something that is learned, absorbed, repeated, until it feels like truth. And by the time it feels like truth, it is already too late. Long before Adolf Hitler became a name the world would never forget, long before uniforms, speeches, and armies, there was only an idea. Invisible, unquestioned, passed from one generation to the next like a quiet inheritance. An idea that said, when things go wrong, someone must be to blame. And in parts of Europe, that someone had already been chosen. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, across Austria and Germany, anti-Semitism was not hidden in the shadows. It existed in everyday conversations, in newspapers, in political speeches, in jokes that people repeated without thinking. It was not always loud or violent, but it was always there, quietly shaping perception. Jewish communities, despite contributing to society in countless ways, were often portrayed as outsiders. Different, suspicious. During times of economic hardship or political uncertainty, suspicion easily turned into accusation. Factories closed? Blame the Jews. Prices rising? Blame the Jews. The world changing too fast? Blame the Jews. It was a pattern so simple that people stopped questioning it. And that is how dangerous ideas survive, not because they are proven, but because they are repeated. There were voices at the time who used this pattern to gain power. Politicians who understood that fear is easier to control than truth. That people, when uncertain, don't always look for facts. They look for direction, for clarity, for someone to tell them who is responsible for their suffering. And when someone provides that answer, even if it is false, it can feel like relief. Because blame is comforting. It removes responsibility. It gives shape to chaos. It transforms confusion into certainty. This was the environment into which Hitler was born, not into a vacuum of hate, but into a system where hate already had roots. He grew up hearing ideas that had been normalized long before he ever questioned them. Ideas that divided people into us and them. Ideas that reduced complex human beings into simple labels. At first, these ideas may not have seemed extraordinary. They were part of the background noise of society. The kind of things people say without thinking. The kind of beliefs that go unchallenged because that's just how things are. But background noise has power. Because what you hear often enough, you begin to accept. What you accept, you begin to believe. And what you believe can eventually define how you see the world. This is how the seed is planted. Not with a single moment. Not with a single event. But with repetition. With exposure. With silence from those who might have challenged it, but didn't. And so, before Hitler ever formed his own ideology, before he ever spoke to crowds or wrote his thoughts, the foundation was already there. A world that had normalized suspicion. A culture that had accepted blame without evidence. A society that, in moments of weakness, looked for an easy target instead of a difficult truth. And within that world, a young mind was growing. A mind that would not just accept these ideas, but eventually amplify them. Because most people live within the ideas they inherit. But some people take those ideas and turn them into something far more dangerous. They give them structure, direction, power. And when that happens, hate is no longer just a feeling. It becomes a force that can move nations, a force that can rewrite reality, a force that, once unleashed, is almost impossible to control. This is where the story truly begins. Not with war, not with destruction, but with something far quieter and far more dangerous. An idea that no one stopped. Before Adolf Hitler became a figure of power, he was a man drifting without direction, living in the shadows of a city that was alive with noise, tension, and competing ideas. Vienna, between 1908 and 1913, was not just a place. It was an atmosphere, a collision of cultures, ambitions, and fears, and for someone already carrying frustration and disappointment, it became the perfect environment for something darker to take shape. Hitler arrived there with hopes of becoming an artist, but those hopes were quickly crushed when he was rejected from the Academy of Fine Arts. Not once but twice, and that rejection did more than close a door. It wounded his sense of identity, leaving him with a growing feeling that the world had denied him something he deserved. And when a person begins to feel that the world is unfair, the mind starts searching for reasons, not necessarily true ones, but satisfying ones. He lived in poverty, moving between hostels and shelters, surrounded by others who were also struggling. People who spoke openly about their frustrations, their anger, their need to explain why life was not working in their favor. And in such environments, ideas spread quickly, especially the kind that offer simple answers to complex problems. Vienna at that time was filled with political voices, newspapers competing for attention, leaders trying to gain influence. And among them were those who had already mastered the art of using division as a tool. Figures like Karl Lueger, who understood that if you could give people a target for their anger, you could gain their loyalty, and his rhetoric, openly anti-Semitic, was not hidden or subtle. It was public, normalized, and effective, which meant that someone like Hitler, already searching for meaning in his failures, was constantly exposed to a worldview that framed Jews not as individuals, but as a collective problem, a convenient explanation for societal struggles. What is important to understand here is not just that Hitler heard these ideas, but that he was in a mental state where he was ready to accept them, because when life feels out of control, the human mind gravitates toward explanations that restore a sense of order, even if that order is built on falsehoods. And so day after day, through newspapers, conversations, and observation, he absorbed narratives that linked personal failure with larger conspiracies, that transformed disappointment into resentment, and resentment into belief. He spent hours reading, watching, listening, not as a critical thinker questioning what he consumed, but as someone collecting pieces of a puzzle he was trying to complete, a puzzle that would explain why he had failed, why society felt unstable, why the world seemed to reward others and not him. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his thinking began to shift, no longer seeing individuals but categories, no longer seeing complexity but patterns. And this is where the danger begins, because once you reduce people to categories, it becomes easier to assign blame without evidence, easier to accept generalizations as truth, easier to build a worldview that feels coherent but is fundamentally flawed. Vienna did not create anti-Semitism, but it gave it a stage, it amplified it, it made it visible and acceptable. And for Hitler, it provided not just exposure but reinforcement, because the ideas he encountered were not isolated. They were echoed by others, repeated in different forms, giving the illusion of consensus. And when an idea appears everywhere, it begins to feel undeniable. At the same time, his personal isolation played a crucial role, because without strong relationships or influences to challenge his thinking, there was nothing to counterbalance what he was absorbing, no voice saying this is wrong, no perspective offering a different explanation. And in that vacuum, the ideas he encountered were free to grow unchecked, turning from thoughts into convictions, from possibilities into certainties. It is important to understand that this transformation was not sudden. There was no single moment where everything changed, but rather a gradual process where exposure, emotion, and environment combined to shape perception. And by the time he left Vienna, the foundation of his worldview had already been laid, a worldview that interpreted reality through the lens of division and blame, a worldview that would later be expanded, intensified, and weaponized. What makes this stage of his life so significant is that it shows how powerful an environment can be in shaping belief, how repeated exposure to the same ideas can normalize them, how personal struggle can make harmful explanations feel convincing, and how the absence of critical challenge can allow those explanations to solidify into ideology. Because Hitler did not emerge from Vienna as a fully formed extremist leader, but he left as someone whose thinking had been deeply influenced, someone who had begun to see the world not as it was, but as he had been taught to interpret it, and that interpretation, built on resentment and reinforced by repetition, would become the lens through which he viewed everything that followed. When World War I began, it did something that nothing else had done for Adolf Hitler up to that point. It gave him direction. For the first time, he was no longer drifting, no longer just another struggling figure lost in a crowded city. The war gave him structure, identity, and a sense of belonging that had been missing from his life. He volunteered to serve and found purpose in discipline, in routine, in being part of something larger than himself. And in that environment, his personal frustrations seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a clear mission and a defined role. But what the war built in him emotionally would later make its ending even more devastating. Because when a person attaches their sense of meaning to something external, the collapse of that thing creates a void that demands to be filled. And the collapse came suddenly. Germany's defeat was not just military, it was psychological. The empire fell, the economy spiraled, and the social order that people had relied on began to break apart. For many Germans, the end of the war did not feel like a conclusion. It felt like confusion, like something unfinished, something that did not match the expectations they had been given. Soldiers returned home to a country that no longer resembled the one they had left, and for Hitler, this was not just a national loss. It was personal. The structure that had given him purpose disappeared overnight, and in its place came uncertainty, instability, and a deep sense of humiliation that spread across the nation. But human beings struggle to accept complex defeats. The truth, that wars are lost through a combination of strategic, economic, and logistical failures, is often too difficult to process, especially in moments of emotional vulnerability. People don't just want explanations. They want explanations that make sense of their pain, that preserve their pride, that redirect their anger. And in post-war Germany, such an explanation began to spread, not as a carefully examined fact, but as a powerful narrative. It became known as the stab-in-the-back myth. The idea was simple and emotionally satisfying. Germany had not truly been defeated on the battlefield. It had been betrayed from within. According to this narrative, internal enemies, politicians, intellectuals, and most dangerously, Jews, had undermined the nation's efforts, weakening it at the moment it needed strength. There was no evidence to support this claim, but evidence was not what gave the idea power. Its power came from its ability to transform humiliation into anger, to replace confusion with certainty, and to offer a clear target for blame. And for Hitler, this narrative was not just persuasive, it was transformative. It connected everything he had already begun to believe with a national story that seemed to confirm it. The ideas he had absorbed in Vienna, the resentment that had been growing inside him, the need to explain his own failures, all of it suddenly fit into a larger framework. Now, his personal frustrations were no longer isolated. They were part of a broader struggle, a perceived conflict between forces that he believed were shaping the fate of the nation. This is the moment where belief deepens, where scattered thoughts begin to form a coherent ideology, because when a person finds a narrative that explains both their personal experience and the state of the world around them, it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge. At the same time, Germany itself was in crisis. The aftermath of the war brought economic collapse, hyperinflation, and widespread unemployment. Everyday life became unstable, unpredictable, and for many people, unbearable. In such conditions, fear and anger are not just emotions. They become forces that shape perception, that influence what people are willing to believe and who they are willing to trust. And narratives like this stab-in-the-back myth thrive in exactly these conditions, because they offer something that reality often cannot: simplicity. A clear cause, a clear enemy. For Hitler, this was the turning point. What had once been exposure and resentment now became conviction. What had once been ideas he encountered became ideas he accepted as truth. And once a belief reaches that level, it no longer feels like a belief, it feels like reality itself. This is how ideology is formed, not in a single moment of realization, but through a gradual process where emotion, environment, and narrative align in a way that reinforces itself, making alternative perspectives seem not just incorrect, but impossible. From this point forward, Hitler's thinking would no longer be shaped by questioning, but by confirmation. He would seek out information that supported what he already believed, ignore anything that contradicted it, and continue building a worldview that framed history, society, and human relationships through a lens of division and blame. And this is what makes this stage so critical, because it shows how a powerful narrative, when combined with emotional vulnerability and social instability, can transform not just opinions, but identity itself. The war had given him purpose. Its aftermath gave him something far more dangerous: a cause. By the time Adolf Hitler moved beyond the chaos of post-war Germany, something inside him had changed permanently, because what had once been fragments of thought, resentment from Vienna, anger from defeat, narratives of betrayal, had now fused into something far more structured. This was no longer confusion searching for answers. It was certainty demanding expression, and certainty, when built on unchecked belief, can become one of the most powerful and dangerous forces a person can carry. Hitler did not see himself as someone driven by hatred. In his mind, he was someone who understood the world more clearly than others, someone who had uncovered what he believed to be hidden truths, and that belief gave him a sense of mission, a feeling that he was not just reacting to history, but shaping it. This is where the transformation becomes critical, because there is a difference between holding an opinion and building an ideology. An opinion can be questioned, debated, even changed, but an ideology is something else entirely. It organizes thoughts, filters reality, and creates a system where every new piece of information is interpreted in a way that reinforces what is already believed. Hitler's worldview began to operate exactly like this, absorbing ideas that supported it and rejecting anything that challenged it. And over time, it became self-sustaining, no longer needing proof because it interpreted everything as proof. In this system, Jews were no longer seen as individuals with diverse lives and identities. They were reduced to a single concept, a constructed image that could be blamed for multiple problems at once. And this reduction is what made the ideology so dangerous, because when you turn a group of people into an abstract idea, it becomes easier to justify actions against them. The writing of Mein Kampf marked a moment where these ideas were no longer internal. They were declared, organized, and presented as a coherent explanation of the world. In its pages, Hitler outlined his beliefs with a tone of absolute certainty, combining elements of nationalism, racial theory, and conspiracy into a narrative that portrayed Jews as a central threat to Germany's future. There was no credible evidence behind these claims, no factual foundation that could withstand scrutiny. But the power of the text did not come from truth. It came from its ability to simplify complexity and to present that simplification with confidence. For readers who were already experiencing fear, instability, and a loss of direction, such certainty could feel reassuring because it replaced confusion with clarity, even if that clarity was built on distortion. At the same time, Hitler was learning something equally important: how to communicate these ideas in a way that resonated with others. He understood that people are not moved by detailed arguments or careful analysis, especially in times of crisis. They are moved by emotion, by repetition, by messages that are easy to understand and difficult to forget. His speeches were not designed to inform. They were designed to persuade, to create a sense of urgency, to unify listeners around a shared perception of reality. He spoke in a way that transformed abstract fears into immediate concerns, that connected personal struggles with larger narratives, and that framed his ideology not as one possible perspective, but as the only logical conclusion. This is how propaganda begins to take shape, not as a single lie, but as a system of communication that reinforces itself. The same ideas are repeated in different forms, through different channels, until they begin to feel familiar, and familiarity can easily be mistaken for truth. Over time, the repetition reduces resistance, making even extreme claims seem less shocking, less questionable, more acceptable. And once an idea reaches that point, it no longer needs to convince everyone. It only needs to convince enough people to create momentum, because momentum itself becomes a force that draws others in. What makes this stage so dangerous is that the ideology does not present itself as hatred. It presents itself as explanation. It claims to reveal hidden patterns, to expose unseen forces, to make sense of a complicated world. And for those who are searching for certainty, that promise can be incredibly appealing. But the cost of that certainty is the loss of nuance, the loss of critical thinking, and ultimately, the loss of empathy, because once a person fully accepts an ideology that divides the world into rigid categories, it becomes increasingly difficult to see individuals beyond those categories. By this point, Hitler was no longer just a man shaped by his environment. He had become someone who was actively shaping the perceptions of others, turning his personal beliefs into a shared narrative that could influence how people understood their own experiences. His ideology provided a framework that others could adopt, a lens through which they could interpret their struggles, their fears, and their hopes. And in doing so, it created a collective mindset that was far more powerful than any single individual. This is the moment where ideas stop being private. They become public. They spread. They take hold. And once they do, they begin to change not just how people think, but how they act. There is a moment in history when ideas stop being just ideas. A moment when words, repeated often enough, believed deeply enough, and accepted widely enough, begin to shape reality itself. And by the time Adolf Hitler rose to full power, that moment had already arrived. Because what had been building for years, through exposure, resentment, narrative, and ideology, was now ready to be enforced. This is what makes the final stage so chilling. Nothing happened suddenly. There was no single day where everything changed overnight. Instead, it happened step by step, decision by decision, each one building on the last, each one pushing the boundary just a little further, until what once seemed unthinkable became normal. At first, it was laws, policies that separated Jewish people from the rest of society, that stripped away rights, limited opportunities, and redefined citizenship. These changes were presented not as acts of cruelty, but as necessary measures, justified through the very ideology that had been carefully constructed over time. And because that ideology had already taken root in the minds of many, the resistance was weaker than it should have been. Then came isolation. Communities were divided, relationships broken, people forced into categories that denied their individuality. The narrative that had once existed in speeches and writings was now visible in everyday life, shaping how people interacted, how they saw one another, how they defined who belonged and who did not. And then came dehumanization. This is always the most dangerous step, because once a group of people is no longer seen as fully human, the limits of what can be done to them begin to disappear. Language changes. Perception changes. Actions that would once have been unthinkable begin to feel justified, even necessary, within the framework of the ideology. And this is how the path leads to something far darker. The Holocaust did not begin with camps. It did not begin with mass violence. It began with ideas that were repeated, accepted, and left unchallenged until they created a reality where such actions could occur. Millions of lives were lost, not because of a single decision, but because of a process that unfolded over years, supported by belief, enabled by silence, and driven by a system that had transformed hatred into policy. And that is the truth that must never be ignored, because it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. This was not just the story of one man. It was the story of how a society can be influenced, how narratives can reshape perception, how ordinary people, in extraordinary circumstances, can become part of something they may not fully understand or choose not to question. History often feels distant, like something separate from the present. But it is not. The patterns remain. The mechanisms remain. The way ideas spread, the way fear can be used, the way blame can be directed toward a chosen target. None of that has disappeared. It has only changed form. And that is why this story matters. Not just to remember what happened, but to recognize how it happened. Because if something like this begins again, it will not announce itself with violence. It will begin the same way it always does. With words, with division, with a simple explanation that feels right, even when it isn't. So the real question is not just what happened in the past. The real question is, would we recognize it if it started happening again? If this made you stop and think, don't let it end here. Drop a comment below. Do you believe people today would recognize these warning signs or ignore them? And if you want more deep, powerful history that goes beyond the surface, subscribe and stay connected. Because understanding the past is the only way to protect the future.